For many of us, Spartacus is portrayed as a honorable, well-hearted, and selfless hero. He's also usually depicted as being rather serious, almost stoic, and is rarely ever seen laughing, though he does give short smiles frequently. He can be more friendly among those he considers friends, and above all, one of his defining traits is that Spartacus isn't one to remain idle when the strong abuse of the weak. But how much do we actually know about Spartacus, the main protagonist and leader of the slave uprising? He actually became a legend very quick. It appears that this occurred in antiquity. But a more intensive, glorifying aspect of Spartacus starts occurring in the middle of the 18th century. For example, in a letter dated 5th April 1769, Voltaire referred to the Spartacus War as indeed the only just war in history, making him a symbol of the struggle of the oppressed for freedom ever since the 18th century. Generally speaking, Spartacus is most known for a Third Servile War, or the so-called Spartacus War, which lasted from 73 to 71 BCE. It is the most well-known slave conflict in ancient times. More than 100,000 people are said to have revolted, defeating numerous Roman armies before being finally vanquished by Crassus. The last 6,000 slaves were eventually crucified along the road from Capua to Rome, while Spartacus himself is said to have bravely perished in battle. But I think that his mere existence is actually taken for granted by both contemporary scholarship and ancient sources. But if we take a closer look at the evidence, there must be some reason to question Spartacus' existence, or at least the way he is depicted. There must have been leaders in the Third Slave War, but was Spartacus ever a real person? Was this the real name of the leader of the Third Slave War? According to our ancient sources, Spartacus was a Thracian who even fought for the Romans. Perhaps he was a deserter who was sold into slavery and ended up in Lentulus Batiatus' gladiatorial school in Capua, from which he escaped with about 70 other slaves. Spartacus then led the slaves across Italy for 3 years with the help of his 2 lieutenants, Crixus and Oenonimus, destroying all Roman forces that were sent to attack them. As for Crixus, we also know that at some point he separates from the main army and dies at Mount Gargano in 72 BCE with 30,000 other soldiers. But nonetheless, Marcus Licinius Crassus defeated all of the slaves in 71 BCE. Now it's time to find some evidence. Our primary sources are the Civil War chapters of Appian of Alexander's Roman history, which he completed around 160 CE, and Plutarch's Crassus biography, both written in Greek during the height of the Roman Empire, roughly 170 to 230 years after the Spartacus War. Other accounts, such as Sallust's History, circa 50 to 35 BCE, and Florus' Epitome of Roman History, circa 100 CE, based on Livy's Roman History, are rather fragmented. The genres we are working with and the author's intentions must also be considered. For instance, Plutarch didn't write history, he wrote biographies. He compares Crassus to the strategos Nicias, an Athenian politician from the 5th century, which is more a study of character and morality than a historical account. So Plutarch's account of Spartacus is essentially just one episode, the one that explores Crassus, personality, virtues, and vices. Sallust, who wrote during a time of ongoing civil wars, was also more interested in the moral decline of the late Republic. He was 15 years old when the Spartacus revolt started, but how reliable are the bits and pieces of his account that have survived? A power struggle between Spartacus and Crixus, in which Spartacus is portrayed as the cautious and reasonable leader, is one of the few passages from Sallust that provide quite surprisingly detailed descriptions of Spartacus. But the truth is that from 73 to 71 BCE, we don't have any eyewitnessing sources referring to Spartacus. How is that even possible? For instance, Cicero, our most prolific author, from the year 80 BC until his murder in 43 BC, lived through the Servile War. He was also aedile in 69 BC and quaestor in 75 BC. Why didn't he pursue the matter further, even if he only wanted to discuss Crassus or Pompey's behavior and ambitions, or the other praetors' carelessness and incompetence, if this was such a significant event and Spartacus the main protagonist? In reality, Cicero only makes passing reference to Spartacus twice, in his Philippici against Mark Antony in 44-43 BC and in 57 BC on the response of the haruspices, where the only mention of Spartacus is, and I quote, to celebrate the games after the fashion of Athenio or Spartacus. Spartacus' name was already a legend by that point. The name Spartacus. Finally, let's start with the name Spartacus. Yes, Spartacus was a Thracian, and his name is typical of the people from that region. Yes, there was a Hellenized Thracian royal dynasty known as the Spartacidae that was established in the 5th century BC by a certain Spartacus or Spartacus I. It is possible that Spartacus, one of our gladiators, belonged to this royal family and was later sold into slavery after, as Flora suggested, deserting the Roman army. However, it is really imaginable that a prominent member of the local aristocracy would become a slave. Our person X, so-called Spartacus, a gladiator and slave, was probably given a name by his new master. This is a typical slave practice, and the use of a stage name by gladiators in Rome in time will become more widespread. It is therefore quite likely that we will never learn Spartacus' real name prior to his arrival in Capua. Now let's examine a Pompey's renowned Spartacus graffiti. This picture is supposed to show Spartacus in the 70s to 40s BC. It depicts combat scenes in which two horsemen engage in combat. It's written from right to the left, and one of them is referred to as Spartax and is written in Oscan. People continued to speak their native language for a very long time after it was written in Oscan, so it is not necessarily accurate to date it to the middle of the 1st century BC. Besides that, did no one make any renovations to the home in the roughly 150 years before Pompeii was destroyed in the year 79 after Christ? That seems unlikely. This graffiti could be interpreted in a variety of ways, perhaps showing a spectacle in Pompeii's amphitheater at any time, and with a gladiator which among the fighters that happened to bear the name Spartacus. Did someone perhaps recreate Spartacus' defeat in the arena? Well, I think it is less likely, given the character with an animal head to the right. But actually, a more important question that we need to ask is when our hero got the name Spartacus. Did he acquire this nickname while a slave, or when he was bought and sold on the slave market, or perhaps more likely while he was receiving training at the Capua Gladiatorial School? Did he choose this name for himself? Because, for example, Eunice, the commander of the First Servile War, adopted the name Antiochus, the name of the Seleucid royal dynasty. Also, the leader of the Second Servile War, Salvus, adopted the name Tryphon, which is again a Seleucid royal name. Therefore, I think there are several possibilities. If it wasn't Spartacus or his master who gave him that name, it's possible that his followers did. Spartacus must have been a fighting name for a charismatic Thracian leader. It's also possible that Crassus and other Roman senators gave the commander of the slave army this nickname out of disrespect or admiration. Maybe in an effort to compensate for their defeats so they won't look that shameful, they invented a brave and noble opponent who, in comparison to a common gladiator, might be considered to have received a good education in military strategy. Or perhaps the name was brought about by our Roman historians. Did they wish to humanize a faceless army of slaves, servants, poor and liberated people? From Diodorus to Plutarch, as we've seen above, our ancient authors are more curious about the particular leaders and their personal characteristics and glorification than an actual description of events. In this regard, we also need to consider how fitting the name Spartacus was, because by Diodorus' description, Eunice, the commander of the First Servile War, was depicted as a degenerate king who was a coward, effeminate, and lived in luxury. This wasn't king-like, and it wasn't appropriate for a leader. However, the ancient sources on Spartacus, such as Appian, Plutarch, and Sallust, paint a very different picture. Brave and devoid of luxury, a military genius who died honorably, and rather a Spartan, which will reject any luxury. Because of this, the name Spartacus, which means son of Sparta, is not only appropriate, but also increases the likelihood that it was a made-up name created specifically to be in opposition to Eunice, the commander of the unsuccessful First Servile War. But that's just my opinion. Let me know in the comments what do you think about it. Thank you for your time. Make sure you hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. This really helps to bring these videos to more people that are asking questions.